Welcome back to Washing with the Word. It is a tremendous privilege to be walking through the Bible together. This week we are in Matthew chapter 18 through 22, Genesis also 18 through 22. Let's start in Matthew. Matthew in chapter 18, we begin a section where we talk about what does life in God's kingdom look like. God's king has been revealed in the person of Jesus. God's kingdom is coming to fruition in his teaching and in his work. But what does our participation in that look like? Well, the first question is the question of greatness. What does it mean to be great in God's kingdom? And it turns out that to be great in God's kingdom is to actually be very humble. It's a small thing to be great in God's kingdom. Now in chapter 19, God's kingdom life is also marked by faithfulness in marriage. Marriage should be upheld with very high esteem. It should not be trivialized or cast away very easily. Divorce is a big issue, and Jesus deals with that in this chapter. Also, there are little children that come to Jesus in this chapter, and that marks an attitude of somebody who is participating in kingdom life. In addition, there's a rich man that comes to talk to Jesus about his participation in the kingdom. Jesus encourages him to follow the law. The man says that he has, but he knows he still lacks something, and Jesus tells him to sell everything that he has, to give it to the poor, and then he can come and follow him. The man can't bring himself to do this. His participation in kingdom life is hindered by his attachment to his wealth. Chapter 20, we see that participation in kingdom life is to be content with the blessing that God gives you. God is generous in his blessing. He showers it upon us. And just because somebody else gets something that we don't think they deserve, that doesn't mean that our blessing is any less or any less important. We should be happy with the things that God has given to us. And to live a kingdom life is to follow Jesus in service to others as well. Now in chapter 21, the story shifts to a focus on Jesus, his final days, the last week before he is crucified in Jerusalem. Jesus enters Jerusalem as the Messiah in a manner prophesied in Zechariah. In addition, we can notice that he's not richly adorned. He doesn't wear a crown. He's not wearing kingly robes. He doesn't lead a great army. He's just a humble carpenter sitting on a donkey, and this is important. Jesus also cleanses the temple, and after he does so, he interacts with the Pharisees on several occasions. They have a few discussions about the authority of Jesus. Where does it come from? Jesus tells them some stories about who he is and what they are doing, what they have done to God's prophets. They recognize themselves in these stories, and they don't like what they see, but they are not yet ready to follow Jesus and to believe him. Then lastly, in chapter 22, there are many additional challenges to Jesus' authority and teaching, but he answers them all. But then he stumps everybody with his own challenge, and nobody can answer this question. This question is based on something that David wrote in the Psalms, where he says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. Well, this is an odd thing because generally speaking, your descendants would honor you as the patriarch. However, David is instead reversing this, and he is giving honor to his descendant by calling him my Lord. This is a very strange thing to do. And Jesus asks the people around him, why would he do this? And they are unable to answer that question because they are unable to believe that Jesus is who he says he is and who he has demonstrated himself to be. So rather than challenge Jesus, we are encouraged to believe him. And the example that we have of what not to do is that of the Pharisees. Now, if we look back to Genesis, again starting in chapter 18, we can see that God's promise to Abraham is beginning, and it is also being preserved. So God promises a son to Abraham and Sarah. This is odd because Sarah is beyond childbearing years, and she actually laughs about this. God catches her laughing and she tries to deny it. This is a very funny interaction, but it turns out that they do in fact have a son. His name is Isaac, and he comes later. Now, in the meantime, God has determined to send judgment upon Sodom. You may remember a few chapters ago that Lot and Abram decided to separate. Lot chose the path that he thought looked good to him, whereas Abram decided to follow God's leading, and he trusted in God. This has led Lot to go to Sodom, a place of tremendous wickedness, and God has determined to bring judgment upon Sodom. Now, in chapter 19, Sodom is destroyed with fire from heaven. God tells Lot to leave. Lot does do this, although he does so under warning and under great reluctance. And the warning is to not turn back and look at what they're leaving. Unfortunately, Lot's wife does this. She turns into a pillar of salt, and Lot's wife is lost. Now, just because Lot has left Sodom, that does not mean sin is no longer a factor. We already have the example of Lot's wife, but Lot's daughters also pursue a sinful relationship with their father in order to pursue their bloodline. So unfortunately, the problem of sin continues to persist. In chapter 20, Abraham again lies about the nature of his relationship with Sarah to a man named Abimelech. He claims that she is his sister rather than his wife. Abimelech seeks to take her as his wife, and God actually stops him from doing this. God prevents sin from happening. And Abimelech goes to Abraham and says, "Why have you done this?" Well, we already know why. This is from chapter 12. But in this case, Abraham says that there is no fear of God in this place. He was afraid that somebody would do something sinful on account of his beautiful wife. And as a result, he became afraid. However, God preserved them, and he decided to make sure that his promise to Abraham stayed intact, not because of Abraham's faithfulness, but because of his own. Chapter 21, Hagar and Ishmael are sent away, but God does choose to preserve them in the wilderness, and he promises Ishmael that he would make him into a great nation. In chapter 22, God tells Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. I would encourage you to spend some time thinking about this particular episode. The reason being is not just because this is a tremendous story. Of course it is. It's very dramatic. But in this case, Isaac is prefacing the person of Jesus. We can see that Isaac is Abraham's only son. He is told to go up a mountain. He carries wood on his back on this journey, and he is laid on that wood for a sacrifice. However, God does tell Abraham not to sacrifice Isaac. However, in doing this, God does show us that when it comes time for his only son to march up a mountain with wood on his back, he would again be laid on that wood to be a sacrifice for us all, and this time the knife would not stop. Praise God for the example that we have in this week's reading. I encourage you towards these lines of thinking. Please consider yourself and consider the Bible carefully, your kingdom life, and the sacrifice of Christ as we continue journeying through the Bible together.